There are moments in life when you realize that the person you pushed away was the only one holding you together. Richard Holloway learned this truth the night flames consumed his mansion, and a woman he had discarded without a second thought ran back into the fire to save the daughter he had forgotten how to love. That night, everything he believed about power, worth, and family turned to ash. And in the smoke and ruin, he finally understood what it meant to be truly rich. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss our upcoming stories. Richard Holloway's mansion stood on the edge of Riverside, Connecticut, a monument to success built on steel and ambition. The house had 23 rooms, floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light, and a silence so thick it felt like a presence of its own. Richard had bought it 7 years ago, when his software company went public, back when his wife Catherine was still alive, and their daughter Sophie was only 3. Back then, the house had been filled with laughter and music, and the smell of Catherine's cooking. Now it was a museum of what used to be. Richard walked through those halls every morning in his tailored suits, his leather shoes clicking against marble floors, and he felt nothing. The grief had carved him hollow. He had learned to wear his wealth like armor, to let his bank account speak louder than his heart ever could. At 42, he had everything money could buy, and nothing that mattered. His daughter, Sophie, now 10 years old, moved through the house like a ghost, quiet and careful, always watching her father's face for signs of the man he used to be. She had learned not to ask for too much. She had learned that her father's love was buried somewhere beneath his meetings and his silence, and she did not know how to dig it out. Grace Thompson had been their maid for 3 years. She was 51 years old, with gentle eyes that held both sorrow and strength, and hands that knew how to comfort even when words failed. She arrived every morning at 7, let herself in through the side entrance, and began the work of keeping the Holloway house from falling apart. She cleaned rooms that no one used. She prepared meals that Richard barely touched. She made sure Sophie's school uniform was pressed and her lunch was packed, and she listened when the girl needed to talk about things her father would not hear. Grace had raised 2 sons on her own after her husband died in a construction accident 20 years ago. Both boys were grown now, one a teacher in Boston, the other a nurse in Philadelphia, and Grace was proud of them in a way that made her eyes shine. She had worked hard her whole life, cleaning houses and offices, saving every dollar, making sure her sons had opportunities she never did. She understood loss. She understood what it meant to keep moving forward even when your heart was broken. And she understood that Sophie Holloway, for all her privilege and her big empty house, was just as lonely as any child Grace had ever known. Richard barely spoke to Grace. He left envelopes with her pay on the kitchen counter every other Friday, crisp bills that he never handed to her directly. He nodded when he passed her in the hallway, a curt acknowledgement that felt more like dismissal than greeting. Grace did not mind. She had worked for families like this before, people who saw her labor but not her humanity. She did her job with quiet dignity and focused on Sophie, who needed her more than anyone in that house. The girl would find Grace in the kitchen after school, backpack still on her shoulders, and she would sit at the counter while Grace peeled carrots or folded laundry. Sophie talked about her day, about the kids at school who ignored her because she was too quiet, about her mother, who she missed every single day, about the books she read to escape into worlds where families hugged and laughed and ate dinner together. Grace listened. She asked questions. She made Sophie feel seen. And when the girl's eyes filled with tears, Grace would pull her close and hold her, smoothing her hair and whispering that it was okay to be sad, that missing someone was proof of how much you loved them. Richard noticed these moments from a distance. He would come home from work and see Grace and Sophie together in the kitchen, heads bent over homework or a recipe, and something in him would tighten. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself Grace was just the maid, doing what she was paid to do. But beneath that, buried deep where he refused to look, was a bitter resentment. Grace could reach his daughter in ways he could not. Grace could make Sophie smile, and that fact, more than anything, reminded Richard of his own failure. He had spent 3 years drowning in work, convincing himself that providing for Sophie was enough, that keeping the bills paid and the house maintained was the same as being a father. He knew it was a lie, but admitting that meant facing the truth about himself, and Richard Holloway had built his entire life on avoiding uncomfortable truths. So he let the resentment grow. He let it fester in the space between him and his daughter, between him and the woman who cared for her. And he waited, though he did not know what he was waiting for something to break. The breaking point came on a cold Tuesday in late October. Richard had been in back-to-back meetings all day, negotiations for a merger that had gone sideways, board members questioning his decisions, numbers that refused to add up the way he needed them to. He came home at 8 in the evening, his jaw tight, his mind still racing through spreadsheets and projections. The house was quiet. Sophie was already in bed. Grace was in the kitchen, wiping down the counters, her coat folded over the back of a chair. Richard poured himself a scotch and stood by the window, staring out at the dark lawn. Grace finished cleaning and picked up her coat, ready to leave. She hesitated, then spoke softly. She told Richard that Sophie had been upset that afternoon, that she had asked again why her father never came to her school events, why he never ate dinner with her, why he seemed so far away. Grace said it gently, not as an accusation but as a concern. She said Sophie needed him. Richard turned slowly, the glass cold in his hand. He looked at Grace with eyes that had gone hard. He asked her, his voice low and controlled, who she thought she was to tell him how to raise his daughter. Grace stepped back, startled by the venom in his tone. She tried to explain that she was not judging him, that she only wanted to help. Richard cut her off. He said she was the maid. He said she was paid to clean, not to offer opinions on his family. The words came out cruel and sharp, weapons he had been sharpening for years without realizing it. Grace stood there, her coat clutched in her hands, and something in her face shifted. The kindness in her eyes did not disappear, but it was joined by something else now, disappointment, sadness, and a quiet resolve. Richard told her she was fired. He said it without thinking, without weighing the consequences, driven only by the need to hurt someone the way he was hurting. He told her to leave and not come back. Grace did not argue. She did not plead for her job. She simply nodded, her lips pressed together, and she walked out of the kitchen, out of the house, into the night. Richard stood there alone, his heart pounding, his hands shaking, and he told himself he had done the right thing. He told himself Grace had overstepped, that she needed to know her place. But the house felt different the moment she left. The silence was no longer just quiet. It was suffocating. And upstairs, Sophie slept, unaware that the one person who made her feel safe was gone. Sophie woke up the next morning and came downstairs expecting to find Grace in the kitchen. Instead, there was only her father, standing by the coffee maker, his back to her. Sophie asked where Grace was. Richard did not turn around. He said Grace did not work for them anymore. Sophie's face went pale. She asked why. Richard said it was not her concern. Sophie's voice rose, trembling, asking if he had fired her. Richard finally looked at his daughter and saw the hurt in her eyes, the disbelief, the anger. Sophie said Grace was the only one who cared about her. Richard told her to stop being dramatic, to get ready for school. Sophie shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks, and she said something that struck Richard like a blow. She said she wished it had been him who died, not her mother. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Richard's face went white. Sophie turned and ran upstairs, slamming her bedroom door. Richard stood alone in the kitchen, his daughter's words echoing in his mind, and for the first time in years, he felt the full weight of what he had become. The days that followed were unbearable. Richard hired a new maid through an agency, a woman named Linda, who was efficient and professional and completely uninterested in anything beyond her tasks. Sophie refused to speak to her father. She ate her meals in silence, left for school without saying goodbye, and spent her evenings locked in her room. Richard tried once to apologize, standing outside her door, his hand raised to knock, but the words would not come. He did not know how to say he was sorry. He did not know how to admit he was wrong. So he let the silence stretch, day after day, until it felt permanent. At night, Richard lay awake and thought about Grace. He thought about the way she had looked at him that last night, not with anger, but with something worse, pity. He thought about Sophie's words, about the truth in them, about the fact that his daughter had loved a maid more than she loved her own father. And he thought about Catherine, his wife, the woman who had seen the best in him, who had believed he could be more than his ambition. He wondered what she would think of him now. He already knew the answer. 3 weeks after Grace left, Richard came home late from another grueling day. It was mid-November now, the air sharp with the promise of winter. He pulled into the driveway and saw that the lights were on upstairs in Sophie's room. He sat in the car for a moment, gathering himself, trying to find the energy to walk into that house and face another silent evening. He finally got out, locked the car, and headed for the front door. He was halfway up the steps when he smelled it. Smoke. Faint at first, then stronger. Richard froze. He looked up and saw a flicker of orange light in one of the second-floor windows. His heart stopped. He ran to the door, fumbling with his keys, shouting Sophie's name. He burst into the house and was hit by a wave of heat and smoke. The fire had started in the kitchen. Later, they would find out it was an electrical fault in the old wiring behind the stove, and it had spread fast, climbing the walls, eating through the wood and plaster. Richard could hear the roar of it, the crackle and hiss, and he could see flames licking up the staircase. He screamed for Sophie. No answer. He ran toward the stairs, but the heat drove him back. The smoke was thick, choking, and he could not see. He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and tried again to reach the stairs. The flames were too intense. He could not get through. Panic seized him, cold and absolute. His daughter was upstairs, and he could not reach her. Then he heard tires screeching outside. The front door burst open, and Grace ran in. She had been driving home from her evening shift at another client's house when she saw the smoke rising from the Holloway mansion. She did not hesitate. She did not think about the fact that Richard had fired her, that he had treated her with cruelty and disdain. She thought only of Sophie. Grace covered her mouth with her scarf and plunged into the smoke. Richard tried to grab her, tried to stop her, but she was already moving, fast and determined, up the stairs into the inferno. Richard stood there, helpless, his mind screaming, and he did not know if he was praying or just begging the universe not to take anyone else from him. The seconds stretched into eternity. He could hear sirens in the distance, fire trucks racing through the streets, but they felt impossibly far away. The house groaned around him, the structure weakening, and Richard thought about all the money he had spent on this place, all the pride he had taken in owning it, and none of it mattered. None of it could save his daughter. Grace found Sophie in her bedroom, unconscious on the floor, overcome by smoke. The girl's room was filling fast, the door hot to the touch, the ceiling crackling overhead. Grace dropped to her knees, pulled Sophie into her arms, and wrapped the girl in a blanket. She hoisted Sophie up, the child's weight pressing against her chest, and she turned back toward the hallway. The stairs were a wall of fire now. Grace could feel the heat searing her skin, could feel her lungs burning with every breath. She prayed. She prayed for strength, for a way out, for this child who deserved a life her father had not yet learned to give her. She saw a window at the end of the hall, the one that overlooked the back porch. Grace stumbled toward it, kicked it open, and looked down. It was a 10-foot drop onto the porch roof. She did not have a choice. She climbed out, holding Sophie tight, and she jumped. They hit the roof hard, Grace taking the impact, pain shooting through her leg. She rolled, cradling Sophie, and then slid down the slope, landing in the garden below, just as the fire trucks pulled into the driveway. Paramedics swarmed them. Grace handed Sophie over, gasping for breath, her body shaking. Firefighters pulled Richard back as he tried to run to his daughter. They worked on Sophie, giving her oxygen, checking her vitals. Grace sat on the grass, watching, her face streaked with soot and tears, her leg throbbing. She did not care about the pain. She only cared that Sophie was breathing. Richard finally broke free from the firefighters and ran to his daughter. Sophie was coughing, her eyes fluttering open, and when she saw her father, she started to cry. Richard gathered her into his arms, holding her so tightly he thought he might break her, and he sobbed. He sobbed in a way he had not since Catherine died, all the grief and fear and regret pouring out of him. Sophie clung to him, her small hands fisting in his shirt, and she whispered that she was sorry. Richard shook his head, told her she had nothing to be sorry for, that he was the one who was sorry, that he had been so wrong about everything. He looked over Sophie's shoulder and saw Grace sitting in the grass, her leg bent at an awkward angle, her breathing labored. Their eyes met. Richard saw the exhaustion in her face, the pain, the quiet acceptance, and he saw something else. Forgiveness. Grace had risked her life for a child whose father had thrown her away. She had run into fire without hesitation, without anger, because that was who she was. Richard realized in that moment that Grace Thompson was more of a parent to Sophie than he had ever been. The firefighters brought the blaze under control, but the mansion was ruined. The kitchen and half of the second floor were gone, the rest smoke-damaged and unstable. Richard and Sophie were taken to the hospital for observation, and Grace was treated for smoke inhalation and a fractured ankle. Richard sat in the waiting room, his daughter asleep on the bed beside him, and he thought about everything he had lost. His wife, his connection to his daughter, his home, and he thought about what he still had. Sophie was alive. Grace was alive. And somewhere in the wreckage of his life, there was still a chance to rebuild, not the house, but the things that actually mattered. When the doctor told him Grace was stable and resting, Richard asked if he could see her. The doctor led him down the hall to Grace's room. She was lying in the bed, her leg elevated, an oxygen mask beside her. She looked up when Richard walked in, and her expression was cautious, guarded. Richard stood at the foot of her bed, and for a long moment he did not know what to say. Then he spoke, his voice rough and broken. He thanked her. He said he knew those words were not enough, that nothing he could say would ever be enough. But he needed her to know that she had saved his daughter's life. Grace nodded slowly. Richard continued. He said he was sorry. He said he had been cruel and wrong, that he had let his pride and his pain turn him into someone he hated. He said he had no right to ask for her forgiveness, but he hoped someday she might be able to give it. Grace looked at him for a long time, her eyes searching his face. Then she spoke. She said she forgave him. She said she had forgiven him the moment she saw the smoke, because holding on to anger would not have saved Sophie. She said forgiveness was not about him deserving it. It was about her choosing peace. Richard felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked away for so long he had forgotten it was there. He asked Grace if she would come back, not as a maid, but as family. He said Sophie needed her, and so did he. Grace smiled, tired but genuine, and she said she would think about it. Richard nodded, accepting that, and he left her to rest. Over the next several weeks, Richard and Sophie stayed in a hotel while the insurance company assessed the damage to the house. Richard took time off work, something he had not done in years, and he spent his days with his daughter. They talked, they cried. They began the slow, painful work of healing. Sophie told him about the nightmares she had been having, about how scared she had been that he would never love her the way he used to. Richard listened, and he did not make excuses. He told her he had been lost, that losing her mother had broken something in him, but that was not her fault. He said he was going to do better. He said he was going to be the father she deserved. And he meant it. Sophie asked about Grace every day. She wanted to see her, to thank her, to make sure she was okay. Richard arranged for them to visit as soon as Grace was released from the hospital. When they walked into Grace's small apartment in the city, Sophie ran to her and wrapped her arms around her, careful of her injured leg. Grace held the girl, smoothing her hair, and Richard saw the love in her eyes, the kind of love that did not need blood or obligation. It just was. Richard stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of his place in this moment. Grace invited him in, and they sat together in her tiny living room, the three of them, and they talked. Grace told Sophie about her own sons, about the struggles they had faced and overcome, and Sophie listened with wide eyes. Richard asked Grace about her life, really asked, and she told him. She talked about growing up in North Carolina, about moving north after her husband died, about the sacrifices she had made and the joys she had found in small moments. Richard realized he had never bothered to learn any of this. He had worked beside this woman for 3 years and never once asked her about her life. The shame of it sat heavy in his chest. Before they left, Richard asked Grace again if she would come back. He said he wanted to rebuild, not just the house, but their lives. He said he wanted Sophie to grow up with someone who knew how to love without conditions, because he was still learning. Grace looked at him and then at Sophie, and she said yes. The rebuilding took months. Richard decided not to repair the mansion the way it had been. Instead, he worked with an architect to redesign it, making it smaller, warmer, a home instead of a monument. Grace moved into a guest suite on the first floor, and Sophie's room was built right next to Richard's, with a door connecting them so she would never feel alone. Richard cut back on his work hours, delegated more at the office, and made sure he was home for dinner every night. Grace cooked, and they ate together at the kitchen table, the three of them, talking about their days, laughing at Sophie's stories, planning weekend trips and holidays. It was not perfect. Richard still struggled with his grief, with the guilt of the years he had wasted. But he was trying. And trying, Grace told him one evening, was what mattered. Sophie blossomed. She smiled more. She joined the drama club at school and made friends. She started writing stories about families who found each other in unexpected ways. She read them aloud at dinner, and Richard and Grace listened, their hearts full. One night Sophie asked if Grace would come to her school's parent night. She said she wanted to introduce Grace as her family. Richard nodded immediately, and Grace's eyes filled with tears. She said she would be honored. A year after the fire, Richard stood in the rebuilt kitchen, the morning light streaming through the windows, and he watched Grace and Sophie making pancakes together. Sophie was laughing, her hair tied back, flour on her nose. Grace was teasing her about the lopsided shapes, her smile bright and easy. Richard felt something he had not felt in years, contentment. Not the hollow satisfaction of a closed business deal or a big paycheck, but real, deep contentment. He thought about the night of the fire, about how close he had come to losing everything that mattered. He thought about the man he had been, cold and distant and drowning in his own bitterness. And he thought about the man he was trying to become, someone his daughter could trust, someone Grace could respect. He walked over to them, and Sophie handed him a spatula. She asked if he wanted to help. Richard smiled, really smiled, and he said yes. They cooked together, the three of them, and the kitchen filled with warmth and laughter and the smell of breakfast. And in that moment, Richard understood what Grace had known all along. Family was not about blood or money or the size of your house. It was about showing up. It was about choosing to love, even when it was hard, even when you were afraid. It was about the courage to let people in, to forgive, to be forgiven. Grace's sons came to visit for Thanksgiving, and the house was full for the first time since Catherine died. There was noise and chaos and too much food, and Richard loved every second of it. He listened to Grace's sons tell stories about their mother, about the sacrifices she had made, the strength she had shown, and he felt grateful, deeply grateful, that this woman had chosen to forgive him, to stay, to become part of their lives. Sophie sat between Grace and Richard at the table, and she looked around at the faces surrounding her, and she felt something settle in her chest. She felt safe. She felt loved, and she felt like she finally had a family again. After dinner, Richard and Grace stood on the back porch, watching the kids play in the yard. Richard thanked her again, for everything. Grace shook her head gently. She said he did not need to keep thanking her. She said they had all saved each other. Richard thought about that, and he realized she was right. Grace had saved Sophie from the fire, but she had also saved Richard from himself, from the loneliness and pride that had been eating him alive. And in return, Richard and Sophie had given Grace something too, a place to belong, a family that chose her, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Time moved forward. Sophie grew older, taller, her face losing the soft roundness of childhood. She thrived in school, made the honor roll, auditioned for the lead in the school play, and got it. Richard was there for every performance, every parent-teacher conference, every moment that mattered. He had learned that being present was not about grand gestures or expensive gifts. It was about showing up, day after day, and proving with your actions that you cared. Grace continued to be the heartbeat of their home. She cooked and cleaned, yes, but more than that, she listened. She offered wisdom when it was needed and silence when that was better. She became the grandmother Sophie had never had, the steady presence that anchored them all. Richard's business continued to grow, but he no longer defined himself by it. He was successful, yes, but he was also a father. He was also a friend. And those roles, he had learned, were far more important than any title or bank balance. One evening, 2 years after the fire, Richard sat in his study, going through some old photo albums. He found pictures of Catherine, of their early years together, of Sophie as a baby. He felt the familiar ache of loss, but it was softer now, less sharp. He missed Catherine every day, but he had learned to carry that grief without letting it consume him. He heard a knock on the door, and Grace stepped in. She asked if he was okay. Richard nodded. He showed her the pictures, and they looked through them together. Grace pointed to one of Catherine holding baby Sophie, her face radiant with joy. Grace said Catherine would be proud of him. Richard's throat tightened. He asked how she could know that. Grace said because she saw the man he had become. She saw how much he loved Sophie, how hard he worked to be better. She said Catherine would see that too. Richard thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. Grace squeezed his hand, and then she left him alone with his memories. Richard sat there for a long time, and he made a promise to Catherine wherever she was. He promised to keep being the father Sophie needed. He promised to honor the second chance he had been given. And he promised to never forget that real wealth was measured in love, not money. Sophie graduated from middle school, then high school. She got into a good college, studying literature and creative writing, following her passion for stories. The day Richard and Grace drove her to campus, Richard felt a bittersweet mixture of pride and loss. His little girl was growing up, becoming her own person, and he was so proud he could barely speak. They helped her move into her dorm, and when it was time to say goodbye, Sophie hugged them both fiercely. She told Richard she loved him, that she was proud of him too. She told Grace that she would not have made it this far without her, that Grace was the strongest, kindest person she knew. Grace held Sophie's face in her hands and told her to go be brave, to write her story, to remember where she came from and who loved her. And then they left, Richard and Grace, driving back to the house that had once been a mansion and was now just a home. They were quieter on the drive back, both of them processing the shift, the next chapter. Richard glanced at Grace and said he did not know what he would do when Sophie was gone. Grace smiled. She said they would figure it out together, and Richard believed her. The years continued to pass. Sophie came home for holidays and summers, bringing friends and laughter and new ideas. She published her first short story in a literary magazine, and Richard framed it, hung it in his office. Grace's health began to slow, arthritis settling into her hands, her steps a little slower. Richard hired help for the heavier tasks, insisting that Grace had done enough, that it was time for her to rest. Grace resisted at first, but eventually she accepted, spending her days reading and gardening and video calling her sons and grandchildren. Richard made sure she had everything she needed. He made sure she knew how much she meant to him, to Sophie, to their family. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch together, Grace said something that stayed with Richard forever. She said she had spent her whole life working, serving, taking care of others, and she had never regretted it. But the greatest gift, she said, was being chosen, being loved not because of what she could do, but because of who she was. Richard told her she had given them that gift too. She had chosen to forgive, to stay, to love them even when they did not deserve it, and that had changed everything. Sophie graduated from college and moved to New York to work as an editor. She visited often, and she called every week. Richard retired early, stepping back from his company to spend more time at home. He traveled a little, took up painting, a hobby Catherine had always encouraged him to try. He was not very good, but he enjoyed it, the quiet focus, the permission to create something imperfect. Grace spent more time with her family, surrounded by grandchildren who adored her, and the house, the rebuilt home that had risen from the ashes of tragedy, remained a place of warmth and memory. Richard thought often about the man he used to be, and he felt no connection to that person. He had been hollowed out by grief and pride, convinced that control and money could protect him from pain. He had been wrong. The fire had burned away everything false, everything he had been hiding behind. And in the ashes, he had found what really mattered: love, forgiveness, family. Not the family you were born into, but the family you chose, the people who showed up when everything fell apart and helped you rebuild. One winter evening, many years after the fire, Richard sat by the fireplace with a blanket over his knees. Grace was across from him, reading a book, her glasses perched on her nose. The house was quiet, Sophie visiting friends in the city, and the two of them were content in the silence. Richard looked at Grace, and he felt a deep, abiding gratitude. She had saved his daughter's life. But more than that, she had saved his. She had shown him what it meant to be human, to be humble, to let go of the armor and let people in. He said her name softly. Grace looked up, her eyes warm and patient. Richard said he wanted her to know that she was the best thing that had ever happened to their family. Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. She said he was wrong. She said Sophie was the best thing, and being part of her life, watching her grow, loving her, that was the gift. Richard nodded, understanding. They sat together in the firelight, two people who had found each other in the midst of loss and built something beautiful. And as the snow fell softly outside, covering the world in quiet white, Richard felt at peace. The story of Richard Holloway and Grace Thompson is not a story about a billionaire and his maid. It is a story about pride and humility, about loss and redemption, about the ways we break and the ways we heal. It is a reminder that the people we dismiss, the ones we overlook or take for granted, are often the ones who hold the greatest wisdom, the deepest strength. Grace did not save Sophie because she was paid to. She saved her because love does not calculate, does not weigh the cost. Love simply acts. And Richard learned, through pain and fire and the patient grace of a woman who refused to let bitterness define her, that true wealth is not found in what you own. It is found in who you love and who loves you in return. The mansion burned, but from the ashes a family was reborn, and that family, imperfect and hard-won, was worth more than any fortune Richard had ever earned.